And so to introduce tonight's keynote speaker, I'm going to call on someone who knows BPI from the inside out, and that is Timothy Wright III. Now, Tim's first stint with BPI was as a staff attorney after clerking in the Illinois Northern District, and for the last 25 years, he's been a loyal and distinguished member of our BPI board. And along the way, the breadth of Tim's accomplishments is truly impressive. He served as special counsel to Mayor Harold Washington. He participated in the South African constitutional negotiations that led to the release of Nelson Mandela. He's worked for 3 U.S. presidents, including service as President-elect Clinton's Director of Domestic Policy. He's currently a managing partner at Quinteros, Prieto, Wood & Boyer. And if all of this isn't impressive enough, listen to this. Today, he's contemplating a whole new area of endeavor as he pursues a Master's of Divinity at the Chicago Theological Seminary. So it's my pleasure to give you BPI Director and my good friend, Tim Wright.
Thank you, Hoy. Let me know the next time you want me to write that speech again. You know, a speaker introduction should be simple enough. A couple of salient facts, a few career highlights, and a little third-party praise. But you know what? That approach is entirely inadequate for the man that I am privileged to introduce tonight. In a few minutes, you are going to hear from a truly extraordinary person, a civil rights hero of our time. Now, Bryan Stevenson is the executive director of EJI, the Equal Justice Initiative based in Montgomery, Alabama. EJI, founded by Bryan 25 years ago, provides legal representation of poor people, to prisoners, juvenile offenders who've been denied justice, people wrongly convicted or charged with violent crimes, and others who face racial bias or prosecutorial misconduct. Bryan and EJI are responsible for reversals or reduced sentences in over 65 death penalty cases. Now, and if this isn't enough, Professor Stevenson also teaches law at New York University. After graduating from Harvard Law School and the Kennedy School of Government, with a world of highly lucrative opportunities and possibilities before him, Bryan chose the road less traveled. He signed on with the Southern Center for Human Rights in Atlanta, and then moved on to become the executive director of the Alabama Capital Representation Resource Center before founding EJI. Today, he is recognized as one of the most effective public interest lawyers in this country. Bryan's accomplishments have attracted international recognition, including the MacArthur Genius Award, a Reebok Human Rights Award, the NAACP William Robert Ming Advocacy Award, the ACLU National Medal of Liberty, the Ford Foundation Visionaries Award, and top honors at just about every national legal organization in this country. The list goes on. But I want to circle back to Bryan Stevenson, the person, and his life's work. Litigating in Alabama, teaching in New York, and speaking out across the country, just like he's doing here tonight. I want to talk about Brian, the person. One of his colleagues summed him up real well. He says, when you work closely with Brian, what you discover is that the stories about him, the brilliance, the round-the-clock schedule, the selfless devotion to others are absolutely true. And if anything, he says they're understated. Now, when the board of BPI decided to pursue Brian as our keynote speaker, I reached out to an old friend I thought might have known him. I called Charles Ogletree at Harvard Law. And Tree, as we call him, called me back. And I told him that I needed to reach Brian Stevenson. Tree just starts to laugh on the phone. And he says, good luck. He says, you're going to need it to catch up with him because he's incredibly busy. Now, just this past Saturday, as I was thinking about what to say about Brian Stevenson tonight, I heard Attorney General Eric Holder's remarks about the 60th anniversary of Brown versus the Board of Education. And they captured Brian Stevenson to a T. This is what Attorney General Holder said, quote, as we recommit ourselves to the critical work that remains before us, it's worth remembering that the outcome in Brown versus the board was never inevitable. For 6 decades, it has provided resounding proof that within the framework of our judicial system and through the power of collective action, that progress is possible. And today, it continues to show us that those who are willing to struggle, to march toward justice, to stand up for principle, can and do change the world for better. It's BPI's great privilege and good luck to have with us tonight such a person. Please welcome Brian Stevenson.
Thank you. That was great. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. This is such an extraordinary honor for me. There are some amazing people in this room, some fantastic advocates, lawyers, activists, organizers, people who care deeply about justice and eliminating the challenges that have created so much despair and hopelessness in this community. I just really want to share a few things with you. I was persuaded by someone to tell a story. I tell too much, but they insisted. But I was looking at the program and listening to these wonderful honorees. Amazing work. I'm just so honored to be sharing this stage tonight with Crystal and the incredible work she's doing around housing, and Julie and the people from the folks from the Bloom Center who do such extraordinary stuff. And I just see so many people here who have fought hard to create an identity that makes a difference in this community. And I just wanted to start by saying, hold on to your identity. Protect your identity. Be lawyers and teachers and activists and organizers and people who are compassionate, people who are committed, people who are going into difficult places. Be the kind of justice person that appreciates that your identity will allow you to say things and do things that can make a difference. We can say things to the city of Chicago, to the state of Illinois, to this country, and persuade them to actually embrace justice in ways that they don't think is possible. But our identity, our commitment, our energy, our activism will allow us to make people do these things. And I tell this story too much, but I learned about identity from my grandmother. I tell it all the time. I grew up in a family that was poor rural community. We grew up in the rural South. I didn't have a lot. We didn't have a lot, but we had a grandmother who understood the power of identity. And my grandmother was one of these people who was tough and strong. She was the end of every argument in our family. She was the beginning of a lot of arguments in our family. And she had this quality that you always wanted to be near her. She was loving and compassionate. When I would see my grandmother, she'd give me these hugs and she'd squeeze me so tight I could barely breathe. And if I saw her an hour later, she'd say, "Brian, do you still feel me hugging you?" And if I said no, she'd assault me again. And if I said yes, she'd leave me. And she just had this quality, you always wanted to be near her. She was the daughter of people who were enslaved. Her parents were actually born in slavery in the 1850s, and she was born in the 1880s. And the experience of slavery very much shaped the way she saw the world. And when I was a little boy, I spent time with my grandmother, and I was with her one weekend, and she was just staring at me after I got up one morning and was looking at me across the room, and I couldn't figure out what was going on. And finally, she came over to me and she said, "Come on, Brian, you and I are going to have a talk." And she took me by the hand. I never have forgotten this. She took me by the hand. She took me out back, and she said, "Now I'm going to tell you something, but you can't tell anybody what I tell you." I said, "Okay, Mama." And she sat down next to me, and she said, "I want you to know I've been watching you." And she said, "I think you're special." She said, "I think you can do anything you want to do." And I never will forget it. It was just like yesterday hearing her say that. And then she said, "I just want you to promise me 3 things. I said, "Okay, Mama." She said, "The first thing I want you to promise me is that you'll always love your mom." She said, "That's my little girl. I want you to promise me you'll always take care of her." Well, I adored my mom, so I said, "Yes, Mama, I'll do that." And then the second thing she said was, "I want you to promise me that you'll always do the right thing, even when the right thing is the hard thing." And I looked up at my grandmother and I said, "Yes, Mama, I'll do that." And then she said, "The third thing I want you to promise me is that you'll never drink alcohol." And when I was 9 years old, so I said, "Yes, Mama, I'll do that." And I grew up in the country. I have a brother a year older than me and a sister a year younger. When I was about 13 or 14, one day my brother came home and he had this beer and he went out in the woods and he grabbed me and my sister and he had some beer and he gave some to my sister and she had some. They were offering it to me. I was like, no, I'm not going to have any beer. And my brother said, "Come on, have some beer. I had some, your sister had some, have some beer." It's like, no, that's okay. And then my brother stared at me real hard and he said, "Come on, have some beer." And I said, "No." And then he said, "I hope you're not still hung up on that conversation Mama had with you." I said, "What are you talking about?" He says, "A mama tells all the grandchildren that they're special." I was devastated. But I'm going to admit to you tonight that I'm 54, and I've never had a drop of alcohol. And I don't say that because I think there's something virtuous about that. I say that because there's power in identity. We can create a community of professionals, a community of people who are committed to social justice, a community of people who are willing to stand when everybody else remains sitting, a community of people who are willing to speak when everybody else is quiet, and we can have an identity that forces this community to get closer to justice, to get closer to equality, and our identity will be key to that. So hold on to the things that make you just. Hold on to the things that make you compassionate. Hold on to the things that make you want to do something about the inequalities that you see. 4 other points. I'm persuaded that we have to get proximate if we're going to make a difference in our work. I think too often when we do policy work, when we do research work, even when we teach, and even when we litigate and activate and organize, it's easy to kind of start moving away from the things that are difficult. And I'm persuaded that if we're going to create justice, if we're going to end income inequality, we've got to get close to the things that are difficult. We can't go away from where the problems are. We've actually got to get closer. It's proximity that gives us insight and perspective on how to make a difference. I grew up in a poor rural community. Lawyers came into our community. I'm a product of Brown versus Board of Education. I started my education in a school where black children couldn't go to the public schools, in a community where black children couldn't go to the public schools. I had to start my education in the colored school. And lawyers came into our community. They got close to us, and because of their willingness to get close to where I was, I'm standing here talking to you tonight. Proximity is not always easy, but it's necessary. There are nuances we need to understand about the challenges of poverty, about the challenges of being poor in some of these communities, about the challenges of providing effective education, about the challenges of mass incarceration. And if we don't get close, we're not going to be effective. I'm a real advocate for proximity. Spending time, no matter what you do, in places where there's distress, where there's conflict, where there's turmoil, where there's dysfunction. I've been spending my career in the criminal justice system. And we have a criminal justice system today that has been fundamentally altered over the last 40, 50 years. Today, America's a very different place. In 1972, we had 300,000 people in jails and prisons. Today, we have 2.3 million. The United States now has the highest rate of incarceration in the world. The Bureau of Justice reports that 1 in 3 black male babies is expected to go to jail or prison during his lifetime. 1 in 3. That wasn't true in the 20th century. That wasn't true in the 19th century. It's true in the 21st century. We have created conditions in this country that make many young people believe that jail and prison is inevitable. 6 million people on probation. Communities where 50, 60% of the young men of color are in jail and prison. I sit down with 13 and 14-year-old boys. When I have honest conversation with them, they tell me that they know they're either going to be dead or in prison by the time they're 21. And that hopelessness has shaped their worldview. And we have to challenge that. And when you get close to it, you begin to realize things about the importance of being proximate. Well, the second thing I'm persuaded is that we've got to change narratives. You cannot understand problems like mass incarceration, problems like income equality, problems like structural deficits in our educational system, and just stop there. We've got to actually change narratives. We've got to tell a new story about the value of children, about their lives, about how all kids are kids, about how we can save children, how we can turn around this expectation of incarceration. We have to create new narratives that help us understand who we are. Our project has been doing work on race and poverty. I don't believe we've ever talked honestly about the legacy of racial inequality in this country. And because of that, it has frustrated our ability to make the kind of progress many of us would like us to see. But we have this narrative that doesn't get to the truth, and because we haven't gotten to the truth, we still struggle. It doesn't take much to create tension and conflict. We believe we have to start from the beginning, so we've been talking about slavery. We just put out a report about slavery in America because there is this unfinished business, because the 13th Amendment didn't really end slavery. It didn't talk about the myths that were created about people of color, about black people, about descendants of Africans. And because of that, we really didn't deal with the core problem, which was this view that these people weren't really people. They weren't entitled to basic rights. They weren't entitled to respect. And as a result of that, the 13th Amendment didn't really end slavery. Slavery just evolved. It turned into something else. It turned into 100 years of terror. When I talk about the era between Reconstruction and World War II, I use the word terrorism because that's what characterized the lives of people of color in many parts of this country. Many of you, people of color in Chicago, are here because you are refugees of terror. There was lynching and violence and convict leasing and this brutal domination of people, and violence and terror shaped the lives of a whole generation. Older people of color come up to me sometimes and they say, Mr. Stevenson, we get so mad when we hear somebody on TV talking about how we're dealing with terrorism for the first time in our nation's history after 9/11. They say, we grew up with terror. We had to worry about being lynched and being threatened and being bombed and being killed. And that consciousness is not something we've talked about. And so we are committed to putting monuments at lynching sites across this country. We want this country to reflect on that legacy. And even the civil rights movement, I'm a little antagonized by the way we've been talking about it as the 50th anniversary of so many of these milestone events have come up. It's almost as if we think the civil rights movement was this 3-day event. On day 1, Rosa Parks didn't give up her seat on a bus. On day 2, Dr. King led a march on Washington. And on day 3, we signed in all these civil rights laws. And if you think about it as a 3-day moment, of course you're going to be frustrated that we're still talking about those 3 days. But the truth of it is that many people were traumatized. They were brutalized, the humiliation of being subjected to segregation. I used to get mad at my parents. They wouldn't ever take me into town. And I got mad at them. But they didn't want me to see them humiliated by any white person that they encountered. We had a generation of white people who were born in this country who were actually taught that they're better than other people because they're white. And we haven't helped them recover from that conceit, from that abuse. The truth of it is that we never told the truth about what 100 years of segregation and terror and racial humiliation did to all of us. And because we never committed ourselves to truth and reconciliation at the end of the civil rights era, we still struggle. And now we're looking at mass incarceration. Now we're looking at this legacy that is claiming so many lives. And so we've got to change the narrative. We're not going to get where we're trying to go if we don't do that. I'm persuaded without changing narratives about how structural poverty has condemned so many people in this community. It's not just that people aren't trying. It's not just that people don't want to do that, but we have actually created structures and policies and laws that keep people poor. And as a result of that, we've got to talk about these structures. We've got to understand these dynamics. The third thing that I'm persuaded is that we've got to be hopeful. I'm persuaded that the enemy of justice is hopelessness. And it's very hard, even though we don't like to acknowledge it, it's very hard to be hopeful when you do some of the things that many of you do. You see such hopelessness, you see such despair, you see such suffering, such misery. There are so many complicated political structures and social structures getting in the way of progress, and it's easy to become hopeless. But injustice prevails where hopelessness persists. And if we're not hopeful about what we can do, and it's a conscious thing, you've got to work on it. It doesn't happen by itself. And I'm not talking about that pie in the sky stuff. Havel talked about this. Havel said the kind of hopeless hope we need to create justice isn't a preference for optimism over pessimism. It's not some pie in the sky. It's not this idea that everything's going to work out in the end. Havel says the kind of hope you need to create justice is an orientation of the spirit, a willingness to sometimes position yourself in hopeless places and be a witness. And I'm persuaded he's right. And I keep waiting for the point in my life where I'm going to be beyond the point where I have to worry about getting hopeless. I've been representing people on death row for a long time. I've been doing this work. I keep thinking at some point I'll age out of this and I've got that hope thing down. And the truth of it is it doesn't work like that. I have things that provoke me, that challenge me, that worry me. And if I'm not careful, those worries will accumulate. Before I know it, I'll start getting hopeless about something. I don't like the legacy of the Old South. I get provoked when people start talking about the good old days. I live in Alabama, and we tend to romanticize this era where people were being humiliated and lynched and terrorized, and it bothers me. I don't like the Confederate flag. I don't like that Old South stuff. I don't like it when people talk about, let's get back to those good old days. It provokes me. I was going to a prison to work on a case not too long ago, and then outside the prison was a truck, and this truck was like a shrine to the Old South. Had all these bumper stickers on it, had a gun rack, had Confederate flags and all of this stuff, and I looked at some of these bumper stickers. One of them read, quote, "If I'd known it was going to be like this, I'd have picked my own cotton." Hadn't seen that one before, and it was just provoking me. And I went into the prison to go represent this man I'd never met before. It was a new client. I got to the door, and the guard came out. I said, "Hi, I'm here for a legal visit." And the guard said, "You're not a lawyer." I said, "Oh, no, I am a lawyer." He said, "Well, where's your bar card?" I said, "Well, my bar card's in the car." He said, "I need you to get your bar card." I said, "I've never had to show my bar card." He said, "Get back there and get your bar card." So I had to go back and get my bar card to show this guard that I was a lawyer. I said, "I want to go see my client." He said, "Well, you're going to have to go in the bathroom. I'm going to have to give you a strip search." I said, "No, sir, lawyers don't get strip search when they come to this prison." He said, "If you're coming into my prison, you're going to get strip search." And I couldn't find anybody to help me, so I had to submit myself to this humiliating strip search. Came back out, was trying to recover my dignity, and was walking back toward the door, and the guard got me by the arm. He said, hey, you got to go back there and sign that book." I said, "Lawyers don't have to sign that book." He said, "If you're coming into my prison, you're going to sign that book." And so I did. Went back, signed the book. And finally, the guard let me into the area, but before I did, he grabbed me by the arm, and he said, "Hey, did you see that truck out there with all those bumper stickers and flags?" I said, "Yeah, I saw that truck." He said, "I want you to know that that's my truck." Difficult guy. Really provoked me. I went inside, sat down, waited for my client to come out. Like I said, I'd never met this man before. I knew he was disabled. The client came out, he sat down, and the first thing the client said to me was, quote, "Did you bring me a chocolate milkshake?" And I thought to myself, this is the craziest day I've had in a really long time. I said, "No, I didn't bring you a chocolate milkshake. I'm your lawyer. I'm here to represent you." And I started asking my questions, and the client wasn't paying attention. And I realized he was hung up on this milkshake. And I said, "I'm sorry. I didn't know you wanted me to bring you a milkshake. The next time, if they let me, I'll bring you a milkshake." And he smiled. He was a very disabled person. Been in the foster care system as a child. Was in 29 foster homes by the time he was 11 years old. Horribly abused. He was actually abandoned by his foster parents, who took him out into the woods, tied him to a tree, and left him there. He was found 3 days later by hunters. He was schizophrenic by the time he was 13. He was psychotic by the time he was 15, drug addicted to heroin and crack cocaine at 16, homeless at 19, and committed a horrific crime at the age of 20. He'd got terrible representation. We still have a criminal justice system that treats you better if you're rich and guilty than if you're poor and innocent in this country. Wealth, not culpability, shapes outcomes. And because he was poor, he couldn't get the legal help he needed, and he was quickly convicted, sentenced to death. Nobody talked about his mental health history. Nobody talked about his history in the foster care system. Nobody talked about his disabilities. They just convicted him and put him on death row. Well, we started working on the case and came up with a pretty compelling case, I thought. that was going to dramatize his problems. Every time I saw this man, he would ask me about the milkshake, and I'd have to explain. They wouldn't let me bring you one, and then he could follow me. Well, it came time to go to court. We were in court about 2 hours from the prison, and I felt pretty good about the case, and I saw that this guard, who I hadn't seen before, was the guard that brought him to the courthouse. And I went up to him, he was the same as usual. We put on our evidence. I felt really good about the case, and about 3 weeks later, I went back to the prison to talk to this man after the hearing. And when I got to the prison, I saw this truck outside, and I thought, oh God, I got to deal with this guard again. And I walked to the prison, and there, sure enough, was the guard. And I walked inside, and I said, look, I'll get in the bathroom ready for your visit. He said, oh, no, Mr. Stevenson, you don't have to worry about that. And I looked at him really strange. I said, well, I'll go back and sign the book. He said, oh, Mr. Stevenson, I saw you coming, and I signed you in. Completely threw me. I said, well, I appreciate that. Well, I guess I'll go see my client. He said, yes, sir. And he walked me over to the door. I was completely confused by this attitude. And he unlocked the door, and before I walked in, he grabbed me by the arm. He said, Mr. Stevenson, can I tell you something? I said, sure. He said, well, I just want you to know that I was in that courtroom, and I was listening. And I just want you to know that I think what you're doing is a good thing. Completely shocked me. And then he said, I came up in the foster care system too, had it really rough. He said, I didn't think anybody had it as bad as I did, but I realized that maybe your client did, and I just want you to know I think what you're doing is a good thing. Completely shocked me, completely shocked me. And then he said, sir, I would really like to just shake your hand. I put my hand out and we shook hands, and I told him, I said, I can't tell you how much it means to me for you to say what you said. I turned around to go into the prison, and he grabbed me by the arm. He said, wait, I got to tell you something. I said, what do you have to tell me? He said, well, I just want you to know I did something. I said, what'd you do? So on the way back from the courthouse after that hearing, back to the prison, I took an exit, and I took your client to a Wendy's, and I bought him a chocolate milkshake. Now, I know that's a really silly story, but it speaks to me about the importance of us remaining hopeful about what we can do to not only change laws, but to change hearts, to change minds, because you see, justice doesn't come just because we want it. Justice comes when we actually begin to embrace the people who are struggling, the people who challenge us, and we get them to see something in us that allows them to see something in themselves that is better and greater, more hopeful. That's what hope is about. And fourth and finally, I'm persuaded that if we really want to make social justice grow, if we really want to create more equality, if we really want to create more fairness, and I should have warned you earlier that these things kind of get harder as I go along here. But fourth and finally, I'm persuaded if we really want to see things move forward, we've got to choose to do things that are uncomfortable. You see, the truth of it is we can't make justice happen. We can't create equality. We can't create fairness. We can't create the kind of community we want until we decide to do things that are uncomfortable. The Civil Rights Movement was a community of people who decided to do uncomfortable things. There was nothing comfortable about sit-ins. There was nothing comfortable about boycotts. There was nothing comfortable about marches where you were being attacked by the police. Nothing comfortable about being threatened all the time. Nothing comfortable about doing things that you know are going to make you the enemy of people who had power. Every act toward human rights, toward justice, has required people, committed people, to do uncomfortable things. Now, we're all programmed to seek comfort. That's our human nature. We look for the people we know. We sit in the places that make us feel comfortable. That's just how we are. And there's nothing wrong with pursuing comfort, doing comfortable things. I'm not speaking against that. What I'm saying is that we have to choose sometimes to do something uncomfortable. I like comfort. I gave a talk down in Mississippi, and I got off the plane, and people came up to me. They said, oh, Mr. Stevenson, we know all about you. We know what kind of person you are. We know what kind of work you do. And even though we're having this conference at the Doubletree, we didn't get you a room at the Doubletree. We got you a room in a barn in this man's field because we thought that would be more appropriate. I said, what is wrong with you? I said, I want to be in the Doubletree just like everybody else. That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is choosing something that will make a difference even though it's going to be uncomfortable. And again, I keep waiting to get to the point where I feel like I'm past this, right, where I don't have to think about this, but it doesn't happen. You're never too old to have to do something uncomfortable. You're not too young to have to do something uncomfortable. You can't be too wealthy. You can't be too poor. It is a challenge for all of us who want to see justice. I represent people on death row. I've been doing it a long time. We've had a lot of success, as Tim indicated. We've had a lot of people who've gotten released, and we won a lot of cases. I'm always encouraged. But sometimes we don't win. Sometimes people get executed. And it's been painful. We had actually 18 executions in the state of Alabama between 2009 and 2011. And I have a staff of very young and wonderfully talented lawyers, and my young people were trying to stop these executions, and they were getting beat down by these executions. And finally I said, you know what, you all take a break, I'm going to jump in, I'm going to handle these next few, and I jumped back in. I thought I was capable of doing stuff that they couldn't do, and finally I was working on this case, and a man was scheduled to be executed, and it was an intellectually disabled man, and we tried really hard to stop his execution. He was horribly, wrongly convicted, unfairly sentenced. He actually had a plea offer of 20 years, and the lawyer never told him about the plea offer, so he goes to trial and ends up on death row. Couldn't get the court to stay the execution, and on the night that he was scheduled to be executed, I got the call from the Supreme Court denying our last stay motion. I was on the phone with this man, and we were getting close to the time of execution, and he was breaking my heart. He was intellectually disabled, and he also had a very severe speech impediment. And the closer we got to the execution, the harder it was for him to get his words out. And he was trying to tell me, thank you, but he couldn't get his words out. And the harder he tried, the more it just broke my heart. And I was sitting there holding the phone, and I remembered something I'd forgotten. When I was a little boy, my mother took me to church one Sunday, and I was about 9 or 10, and my brother and I and some other friends were talking to these other kids, and there was a little skinny kid I'd never seen before, and he was just standing there silently. And at some point I asked him a question, where are you from, or what are you doing here, or something like that. And this little boy tried to talk. And he also had a severe speech impediment. He couldn't get his words out right. And because I'd never met anybody like that, I did something really ignorant. When I saw this little boy trying to talk and he couldn't get his words out right, I laughed. And my mother was standing across the room, and she saw me laughing at this boy, and she gave me this look I'd never seen before. And she called me over to her, and she grabbed me by the arm, and she said, Brian, don't you ever laugh at somebody because they can't get their words out right. Don't you ever do that. And I tried to defend myself. I said, Mom, I'm sorry, I didn't know. She said, no, you know better than that. And then my mother told me, she said, now you go back over there and you tell that little boy you're sorry. And then she said, I want you to hug that little boy. And then you tell that little boy you love him. I said, Mom, I can't go over there and do it. And she gave me that look again, so I did. I went back over, and I went up to this little boy, and I said, look, man, I'm sorry. And then I kind of lunged at him in my little boy version of a man hug. And then as insincerely as I could, I said to this little boy, and I love you. And I remembered that night, in ways that I had forgotten, that little boy hugging me back and saying flawlessly in my ear, he said, I love you too. And I was thinking about that while I was on the phone with this condemned man about to be executed, and he was trying so hard to get his words out, trying so hard. And the harder he tried, the more it just broke my heart. The tears were running down my face. I was holding the phone. And all he was trying to do was say, thank you for fighting for me. And he finally got his words out. Thank you for fighting for me. Thank you for standing up for me. And then he said, I love you for trying to save my life. And I hung up the phone, and I just thought to myself, I can't do this anymore. It's too hard, too hard, too hard, too hard. Kept thinking about how broken he was, and I just had these questions I didn't have answers for. I was thinking, why do we want to kill all the broken people in this country? Why do we want to do that? Why do we crush broken people? Why do we throw broken people away? And then I started realizing that my life is filled with brokenness. All of my clients broken. Communities I work in have been broken by poverty, broken by racism, broken by hopelessness. I'm in a court system that's been broken by cynicism, broken by corruption, broken by wealth, broken, everything around me. And I realized I don't want to do this anymore. I started to have that conversation with yourself that you have to have before you stop doing something. I started saying, well, if you're going to not do this anymore, you got to figure out why you've been doing it. And I started asking myself, well, why have I been doing this? And I realized something I hadn't realized before. I realized that I don't do what I do because I have to do it. I don't do what I do because I can. I don't do what I do because I have some skills and some training. I don't do what I do because somebody just plopped me down and said, do it. I don't do what I do because I think it's important. I don't even do what I do because I get to talk to wonderful people like you. I realized something that night that I'd never realized before. I realized that I do what I do because I'm broken too. And the truth of it is that when you get close to inequality, when you get close to injustice, when you get close to suffering, when you get close to poverty and misery, when you get close to the abuse of power that so corrupts so many things around us, it will break you.
It'll create little cuts and scars and bruises and injuries, but I want to tell you that there is a power in that breaking. Because then you realize that you're not doing something for somebody over there. You're not doing something for somebody else. You're not trying to help the less fortunate. You are doing this because you need to be healed. You cannot be at peace in a world where there's the kind of inequality, where there is the kind of injustice, where there's the kind of suffering that we see too often. And then you realize that you don't have any choice. You can't stop because you can't get to freedom. You can't get to wholeness. You can't get to health until you stand up for those who need someone to stand up, until you represent the condemned, until you speak for those who need you to speak for them. It's in brokenness that I've learned some really simple things. I've learned that each of us is more than the worst thing we've ever done. I believe that. My clients have taught me that. I believe if somebody tells a lie, they're not just a liar. I think if somebody takes something that doesn't belong to them, they're not just a thief. I think even if you kill somebody, you're not just a killer. There is this basic human dignity that must be respected by law. The second thing I've learned, being broken, is that I've been persuaded that the opposite of poverty is not wealth. I don't believe that. I believe that the opposite of poverty is justice. And we're not going to get to deconstructing poverty, eliminating poverty, until we commit ourselves to a greater degree of justice. And finally, I'm persuaded that you judge the character of a community, the quality of life in a community. I come to Chicago. I love Chicago. It's a beautiful city, but I don't judge it by these beautiful big towers. I don't judge it by a beautiful lakefront. I don't judge it by all the wonderful things I see here. You judge a community. You judge the character of a community, not by how we treat the powerful, the rich, and the privileged. You judge a community by how you treat the poor, the condemned, the incarcerated, the marginalized. And because of that, we've got this great challenge, but also this great opportunity to be a community of professionals and business leaders and lawyers and organizers and activists who stand for justice. And it's hard. I'm not going to lie to you, it's hard. There are days when it gets difficult. But when we do it, there is something resonant that is so affirming. I had the pleasure of meeting this man. I was giving a talk, and I'll end with this. I was giving a talk at a church not too long ago. And it was a small church in the Black Belt in this poor rural community. It was only like 30 or 40 people there. And I was talking, and this older man came into the church. He was in a wheelchair. A little boy wheeled him into the church, and the man was sitting in the back, and he was looking at me really sternly. And I couldn't tell whether he was hostile or what was going on, but I finished my talk, and people came up. There were a lot of young kids there, and I was shaking their hands, and people were very nice. And this man kept sitting in the back staring at me. And finally, he nodded his head, and this little boy wheeled him down to me. And this man came up to me with a very stern look on his face, and he came up to me, and he was pointing his finger, and he finally said to me, he said, "Do you know what you're doing?" And he took me back. I said, I didn't say anything. I just stood back. He said, "I asked you a question. Do you know what you're doing?" And I couldn't tell what he wanted me to say, so I just kept standing there. And then he said, "I'm going to tell you what you're doing." And then he looked at me, he says, "You're beating the drum for justice." And he made me smile. He said, "You're beating the drum for justice." He said, "You keep beating that drum for justice." And it moved me. And then he said, "Come here, come here, come here, come here." And he grabbed me by my jacket, and he pulled me almost into the chair. He said, "I'm going to show you something." He said, "You see this scar I got above my left ear?" He said, "I got that scar in Greene County, Alabama in 1963 trying to register people to vote." He turned his head. He said, "You see the scar I have over here?" I said, "I got that scar at Freedom Summer in Mississippi in 1964 when we tried to help some people who wanted to stand up." He said, "You see this spot back here? That's a bruise I got during the Children's Crusade in Birmingham." He said, "People think I've got scars and cuts and bruises on my head." And then he leaned back and he looked at me. He said, "These aren't my cuts. These aren't my scars. These aren't my bruises." He said, "These are my medals of honor." And the challenge is recognizing that even when we do uncomfortable things, even when it feels hard, there is something on the other side of that that is transformative, that is absolutely transformative. And it is that spirit of transformation that BPI represents, that all of you represent, and that I celebrate here tonight. I never used to understand these things until I got older. I'd hear these speeches from Dr. King where he would talk about the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends toward justice. I didn't get that until I started representing people on death row. I read all that Russian literature when I was a college student, Dostoevsky, and he talked about truth crushed to earth shall rise again. It didn't mean anything until I helped innocent people who had been condemned to die get their freedom. And even growing up in church, they'd say these things. Jesus said, "The first shall be last, the last shall be." It didn't make sense to me until I understood what it meant to stand with poor people who have got a quest, a hunger, a thirst for dignity, for equality. And being in places like this tonight, with a room full of incredible people like you, committed to supporting organizations and standing with causes that are about justice, makes me feel that same feeling, that we can do more, we can create more. And yes, we've got to get closer. Yes, we've got to change narratives. Yes, we've got to be hopeful. Yes, we've got to do uncomfortable things, but it is within our power. And it is that power that I'm here to celebrate tonight. And I'm so grateful that you have given me this opportunity, and I just wish you all the best as you do the important work that needs to be done. Thank you very much.
Brian, thank you so much for being here, and thanks for sharing your moving words with us. It is a real privilege for us to honor you as a BPI champion of the public interest. The inscription reads, "For Brian Stephen of the Equal Justice Initiative, in recognition of and appreciation for your extraordinary courage, leadership, and effectiveness in challenging poverty and racial discrimination in the criminal justice system by fighting against unfair sentencing, working to exonerate innocent prisoners on death row, confronting abuse of the incarcerated, and helping children prosecuted as adults." Thank you.
Great, thank you. Thanks.
That concludes our evening. Thank you so much for being here tonight. I wish you a safe trip home and hope to see you again next year. Thank you.